So, welcome to PreVetted Podcast, a blend of tech and leadership. Our goal is to explore the journeys and stories of our guests, revealing valuable insights about engineering and business, and sharing them with our community. Our guest today is Andrew Hendela. He's the co-founder of Karambit AI. Hello, Andrew. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing great. A little tired, but I mean that's the life of a startup founder. If you're ever feeling well rested, you're probably not doing enough.
There is no rest for the wicked, right?
Oh, I mean you have to rest, but if you have to rest. If you don't, you'll burn out, and that's like something else you have to keep track of as a founder.
Right,
But
right. There is a talk that I saw many months ago, but we were talking about for startup founders, there is no work-life balance. That's a myth, right? It's you're 100% committed to make your startup work, right?
I think that's definitely true. You have to obviously work a lot. But for me personally, I try to make sure that there is a balance because I need to know why I'm doing what I'm doing. Like I have a family, I have 3 kids, I have a wife. So if uh, one of the recommendations I got early on, I got a lot of recommendations because I always like getting other people's advice and figuring out how to work with them. Um, but I was told very early on, like your startup is not worth your family, and I agree with that 100%. Because I mean, part of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing is because I want to help take care of them. I want to do good for the world, but I also want to do good by my family.
Actually, we talked before about what Karambit AI, what your company do, right? So we kind of we kind of missed that for the audience. So
We missed that early. It's okay.
So let's talk a little bit about that. You know what does your company do?
Yeah. So our company, Karambit AI, and it's honestly a lot of the reason why I'm thinking about like, hey, how can we help people that no one else can help? Is our company focuses on software behaviors, and I don't know the way you usually think about it is okay, you download an app on your phone and you get a permissions list. It's like, okay, like it's going to take location data. You don't necessarily know exactly what it's going to do with that, but at least you have something. The problem is if you're not doing a mobile app, if you're just downloading something on your Windows machine, your Mac machine, or like a Linux server, you don't actually know what the behaviors are going to be until you run it. And then you hope it doesn't do anything bad. The problem there is that you're basically trusting your suppliers. You're trusting people who are building software. I mean, if you're building software, you're trusting the libraries you're pulling in. And there's been a series of pretty high profile attacks where someone goes after a supplier to get to their customers. And that's actually why we started our company, because there was a really big one at the end of 2020 called the SolarWinds attack, where SolarWinds cybersecurity company got hacked by
Right.
Russians. Malware gets put into their software. Um, and they had huge customers. Like Microsoft was one of their customers. Um, if you looked at the list before it got scrubbed from the internet, I think you can still use the Wayback Machine, but it had like every government agency in the U.S., probably some state and local governments. I've talked to quite a few customers of theirs since we
Wow.
started, and they were trusted. So, you let your update in, you run it maybe a little bit to test, but then what the attackers did, and it's kind of brilliant if you have like this attacker mindset. They knew what the defenses were going to do. They're like, okay, we'll just get into SolarWinds. It'll get signed. It'll claim its right. So any antivirus is going to say, oh, it came from the right place. It's fine. Just let it run. And then they waited 2 weeks and a random amount of time to start doing bad stuff. And
Wow.
yeah, they waited 2 weeks. And what's kind of interesting is like talking to other people who are like doing IT upgrades. They're like, yeah, like the longest we'll wait like to do a test is like 2 weeks. So even the attackers knew that. Like they understood like, okay, what are they going to possibly look for? And then and then the attackers waited those 2 weeks. It just started calling back to them, and they were able to compromise somewhere around 18,000 customers to the point where they could choose who do I actually want? Like the attackers would be like, okay, Microsoft, that sounds good. Federal government, yeah, I'll take that.
That's kind of better, right?
Yeah, we'll
Better
take that.
target.
Better target. Like we'll get whatever we can or whatever we want. And we saw the aftermath of that. Like there were a lot of people regulating software supply chain security, but they focused on this thing called a software bill of materials, which is essentially your ingredients list. You look at a cereal box, you're like, oh, yeah, I got a bunch of random chemicals in my food. I guess they're fine, right? And the software bill of materials is like that, but for software. Like, hey, what is in this? But it doesn't actually tell you anything about that software. It just says, here's the list, but not if that library is bad, what's it going to do? So we created our company around the idea of, well, let's stop attacks like that. Let's actually inform people about, hey, what does this software do? How is that changing? And is there something new and potentially malicious in here that no one's ever seen before? So we were essentially able to take the expertise we've been gaining for my co-founder and I actually worked together for, it's coming up on 10 years at 3 different companies. So like we work really well together, and we've done really deep automated analysis of software. So we took that expertise, pulled it into our company, and again, the goal of being able to actually change how we understand software. Because right now you just kind of like download it and use it. And if we can make it so people can either understand, or better yet, don't even need to understand, like they can just have a very human readable, they don't have to go down to the level of nerd like me and like get into it. It's like, hey, very high level, what does this thing do? Do they want it? What's a recommendation? And that's essentially the automated technology we've been able to build, taking that expertise we have.
Right. So you were able to put your expertise and your co-founder's expertise into the product, right? Basically you are taking this. So what happens with this? So there was a philosophical approach to cybersecurity, right? And then these hackers were able to basically, I don't want to use the word disrupt because it sounds too marketing-y, right? But, or flashy, right? But basically that's what they did.
Were able
right?
to they were actually able to take advantage of how defense works.
Right.
Because my co-founder and I have done some offensive cybersecurity in the past. So finding bugs in software, exploiting them, thinking like an attacker. And that's what you have to do. You have to figure out, okay, how does defense work? How does this like antivirus, right? How does this antivirus work so I can get around it? How does this particular software I want to exploit work so I can, go through all the path? I can put my data here so it goes all the way through and lets me do whatever I want. So you have to think those things through. And if you do that, like you can do attacks like that, where you just say, okay, well, all right, I will hit their weakest link, because it's just a matter, in some ways for attackers, it's not a matter of like, if, it's when. It's like, okay,
right.
how can I get in? What's the easiest manner? And sometimes, most attacks at this point, they just say, hey, I want to send an email to a bunch of people. If they click a link, all right, I'm in. But if you have better security than that, if you have all the phishing defenses and all of that, then you have to try a little bit harder. And it's like, okay, well, what's the weakest link? Well, hey, they have these, the standard enterprise probably has like 1,000, 10,000 suppliers of various different kinds. If you can get into one of them, now you can get access.
Right. Because they trust the first level, but they don't trust the second level of basically code and libraries that you have. Because right now all the software is interconnected through libraries, third-party libraries. So you can trust the vendor that you have in front of you, but then you don't know they don't even know what's behind.
Right. And even if they know, okay, here's all my libraries, but is there something bad in them? And is there something bad in this new update? Like,
Right.
are we even updating? And if you don't update, now you have like a vulnerability that somebody might know about that they can exploit. But if you do update, what if somebody like compromised like that open source library?
It was good. I was going to ask you about that while you were talking about the libraries. What are your thoughts on close closed source and like closed source libraries? They give you a binary, right? So you cannot see what's going on in there, right? And what your tool is doing is observing behavior, right? Versus using open source library where you can see what's going on. You can see the source and what's going on, whether it's compiled or not, right? You now have access to that. Whether you or any other company actually go
Right.
through the code, right?
And check. Are you actually checking all the source code for this
Yeah.
for the open source? You hope someone else is going to do that at least.
Yeah. I mean, there was a library in NPM in JavaScript that basically, the maintainer decided to just not use anymore, and then it broke like half of the internet, right? At one point, right? And
Yep.
it was a very simple library that was doing something very easy, very simple,
Was
but everybody was
that
using it.
left pad? Like somebody made a
Yeah.
library
Left
for
path.
doing left
Yeah,
pad, and you're like, anyone could implement this, but you don't have to. So you have this one maintainer that has like,
because you have that one library, right?
you know,
And it was not malicious, but all he did was just close the library, right? And then everything broke, right? Or delete the library, something like that. So when you're working with open source, you can see what's going on, but now you have more risk on who's actually maintaining the code, right? We're talking about that. I think you were talking about that. That's how they got into the systems, that they took the maintenance of one of these libraries, right?
well, so there's a few different things you kind of touched on. One is like, closed source libraries versus open source. Our technology actually focuses on the compiled software,
Right.
specifically because you don't always have the source code. But we want to make sure we're checking, hey, that's the thing that's actually going to be run, because source code isn't
Right.
always telling you the truth. So there was a different attack um, in, I think it was the end of February last year, so almost a year ago now, against a library called xeutils, and this was open source, and it was used by SSH, so Secure Shell.
Right.
And this attack was kind of brilliant for a different reason. They they basically, as far as I can tell, like they looked at SSH, they said, okay, what's in here? What libraries do we think we can like get access to? And there was one library that had like one maintainer. So it was like 2 years before this attack, someone decided, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to start pushing really good code to this library. They pushed enough code to become a maintainer. And now they're in charge of that. They're one of the two people who are in charge of that library. So into February last year, after like staging, like they had a binary for testing supposedly, and like a really obfuscated shell script, they said, okay, I guess it's go time. They pushed a commit that made it so when you compiled that software with, and then you linked it with SSH, it rewrote some of the functionality in SSH to have a backdoor in the SSH daemon, and that attack actually funneled all the way down to at least Ubuntu. So huge Linux distro. Um,
it may it got to major leagues.
yeah, it
Yeah.
made its way where it was supposed to go, and the part about that attack that like the reason it got caught is because the attackers were sloppy. Because it was caught because someone at Microsoft, who is a Postgres like developer for Microsoft, because Microsoft pays for like a lot of open source development, noticed that his SSH connection took half a second longer than it had previously, and decided, okay, I'm going to go through, I'm going to do Valgrind, I'm going to do analysis, I'm going to like essentially reverse engineer this thing. Who knows how long that took, right? Days at least of time he took out. He's like, hey, half a second too long. I need to find out what's going on here. Most people would have just like waved it away, but this guy didn't. And he was able to say, there's a back door in this library. Well, what? Um, but if it had taken any less than that half a second, like if it was like, you know, a millisecond, which
Right.
you probably should, like if they'd done more testing, they probably could have gotten it. They would have noticed. They were like, oh, it's a, probably 1 millisecond is probably within the tolerances for what they were doing. But because they were a little sloppy, because they were trying to push it out quick, they got caught.
Right. Right. That's amazing, and that's kind of the risk when you're doing open source, right? You don't actually know where the code is coming from, right?
Right. You know where the code's coming from. You don't really know who the maintainers are. It Some of the reporting I saw on that particular attack, it was supposed to be one person, but it turned out I think it was like a group of like 5 Russians all pretending to be the same person. That's that was at least what the reporting said. So
Right.
but I mean, it kind of makes sense if you're going to do something like that. I mean, you might as well get more people under one name, submit a lot of good code, get trusted. Now you have control over some open source library.
Right. Right. I mean, uh, as an engineer, I am amazed by their creativity, right? Even though it was used for doing unethical stuff, right? So,
Right.
uh, but yeah, so thank you that they were very sloppy, right?
Well,
Sloppy
right, and
enough, right?
right, but that's if they were sloppy enough for a human to go through it, because
Right.
you can't you can't you cannot have a human go through all of the Ubuntu libraries. You can't have that,
Right.
because if you take 8 hour per update, um, it would take years every month, right, for all the updates that come out. So
Right. Right. And the number of libraries and updates that happen are very frequent, right? Well, Ubuntu kind of started with the trend of major and minor versions, which was something novel for the Linux industry, right? Because before Ubuntu, it was, oh, go and compile your own kernel, right? Go and download all this source code, right? And
right,
and they had like 50 50 questions that it wasn't like a wizard, but you have to think about 50 things, right? Like, what is your GPU, right? What is your CPU? There are so many
right.
things, right?
Make sure all of the flags are proper and
Are proper. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So Ubuntu kind of simplifies that a lot, right? And then they start doing these major and minor versions, right? So now you have a stable, quote unquote, server version, right?
right.
At least as a user, because I started with Ubuntu, right? As a user, now you have a release, right? Now you have a number that you can, say, okay, I'm using this version of Ubuntu, right? So, but there's so many libraries there that
Yep. And each
it's,
library is
yeah,
going to have its own version number, right?
right, right. And everybody's using different policies for release. So, you know,
Oh, the version numbering itself is kind of it's its own thing, right? Honestly, that's one of the reasons why, like, so self-revealed materials is like name and version number. Like that's really what it comes down to.
right,
But those version numbers are effectively meaningless unless the developer gives them meaning. So there's like the concept is supposed to be like, major, minor point releases, right? But those only actually have relevance if a developer uses those to mean something. So you can have like a minor release that changes like every single function, but the actual underlying code, we've seen that in some of the analysis we've done on a bunch of libraries, where we'll do comparative analysis to be able to say, hey, how has this thing changed? How are the behaviors changing? And we have some deeper analysis of like, hey, how many functions changed in here? And sometimes it'll be like, hey, it was like 2. 2.0 to 2.1, it's like, how did 90% of this binary change? Like that's a bit much for
Wow,
what
that's a lot.
you would that's a lot
Right.
for what you would think is a minor release, right?
Right, right. And that's what I'm talking about, that they have different policies because there's lack of consistency, right? Um, yeah. And it's kind of order within the chaos, kind of, right? But on the security side, that's a nightmare, right?
It's a huge nightmare. I mean, it's even worse because a lot of times you use version numbers to find vulnerabilities, but you're not required to ever change your version number, right? So you could do an update and then never actually change your version number. It's like, okay, well, which is is this the vulnerable version? I mean, you should be if you're trying to patch a vulnerability, but maybe you're not. Maybe you don't care enough. Let alone the fact that for open source, the bigger libraries are better about having version numbers be consistent. But
Right.
if you're using a small library, you're probably going to have no public reported vulnerabilities in that library because no one checks it. Like
Right.
if nobody's checking like some small left pad, right? If there was like, you know, Ubuntu, you know, leftpad.deb, you download that, you run it, you're like, okay, well, no one's checking this for vulnerabilities. What if there is one? I don't know what. I can only imagine what kind of vulnerability would get snuck into a left pad, right? But
Right.
you don't know. But no one's going to check that because they're just like, oh, it's left pad, it's boring. I'm not going to bother like doing vulnerability analysis for that.
Right. Right. And sometimes they reuse the same version number for, you know, it hasn't been the norm, but I've seen at least 2 or 3 cases of that where they reuse the same version number and then they update the library. So if you don't know that
Mm-hmm.
story, then you think it's the same code, right? And it
Yep.
is not, right? So
Right. I mean, that's the other thing. It's like, oh, hey, there's a this has been the same version for the last 5 years. What? But it's different every time. Yeah.
right, right. So how can you trust a binary or a software in an untrustworthy environment, right?
I mean, that's really what it comes down to. I mean, that's what we're trying to solve, right? That's what we're doing. We're doing it for a, a few major customers, even now,
Right,
like specifically because it always seems like the people who are the biggest targets are the ones that care the most about cutting edge cybersecurity.
right,
We're progressively getting smaller and smaller. Um, but if you're a big target, you need to know what your software is doing. If you've been hit by these kinds of attacks, you're like, oh, okay, this is worth it. This is worth it to work with a smaller company. This is worth it to get that cutting edge analysis. A lot of
right,
like, I'm not going to another startup and say, hey, well, I can try, but like, there has to be other reasons for a startup to want this. Most startups, back to the hundred little fires that are giving at any point. Like for most startups, like cybersecurity isn't like on their radar until it becomes like a compliance issue because they don't have time. So
right, right. Yeah. I mean, if you don't have customers, you have nothing to lose, right? So,
exactly. Right. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. It's like, well,
right,
okay.
right. And it becomes an issue when the risk becomes more and more, the bigger, right? Uh, Higher. Um, so what you do is you get all the code and all the dependencies, and that gives you a non-moving target, right? And then from there, you analyze that code on the behavior level, right?
Yes. So one of the other interesting things is you're saying code, and it is technically code, but it's like assembly code instead of source
Right,
code.
right,
So we'll take that. We'll take the actual binaries, and we get behaviors what's known as through static analysis. So we don't run the software to find behaviors. Um, this comes back to our threat model is attackers are really good at avoiding detection when you're running it. So think, hey, if I run a piece of software, I don't know if I'm going to get all the behaviors because maybe they're going to wait 14 days like the SolarWinds attack did. So we actually,
Right.
so we use an open source tool as like the baseline called Ghidra. It's the NSA's reverse engineering framework. So we use that to get disassembly, and then from the disassembly, we have our analysis on top of it to be able to go and say, okay, hey, this function right here has these behavioral capabilities in it. Oh, this function over here has these capabilities. And then we are able to determine, as we're getting more and more versions, we build up models of, okay, what's expected for this particular kind of software? And if that changes, then we flag like a detection.
Right. Right. I see. So not only you get a non-movable target of, of of the code, but also you freeze it. You don't allow it to run. You chain it to the floor, basically, right?
Essentially, we chain it to the floor. But one of the reasons we do this like analysis of different versions is there's nothing inherently malicious about any given behavior in a computer.
Right.
So like the example I usually give is like ransomware and like Microsoft's BitLocker, which is full disk encryption. They're both encrypting your hard drive. One is like recommended security practice. The other is um, the other is obviously hack, right? You're like, you don't want ransomware, but you want to full disk encrypt your software, your hard drive. So we have that context to help us automatically determine, okay, what's actually intended for this particular software.
Right. Right. So basically, what you're doing is you're generating signatures for every function, right? So that way you say, okay, I analyze this, I know how this works. So if this changes, then I'm going to have to run the analysis again, right? To see if it doesn't, the behavior, the functionality has changed or not, right?
Essentially, yeah, we do that at like different levels. So we do it at
Right.
the function level, we do it at the binary level, we do it at what we call a collection or like a scan level, where it's like, hey, here's an entire package. How are behaviors changing at that level, which is potentially different. And then that way we can analyze, okay, well, this one library within this bigger package is actually the thing that looks suspicious rather than something else that's doing something normal.
Oh, I see. I see. So by package, you mean a lot of files and a lot of binaries that are somehow related, right?
Yeah, think in, you know, an installer, a Docker container, a Debian package you get from
Right.
Ubuntu. So it's this this whole like idea of individual pieces of software packaged together is like normal across the ecosystem.
Right.
Because like
And,
each software is going to have a ton of libraries, like depending on how well it's constructed. So you have to be able to
right.
handle that.
Right. Um, I I work a lot, a lot, a lot. I build applications in Ruby and JavaScript, and I used to do .NET. I used to do, Java many years ago, right?
Right.
But anyway, it's and those are more corporate tools, right? Where they have uh, you can build these packages, and that's the application, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have less dependencies to the outside world, right? But with Ruby, and
Yeah.
particularly with JavaScript, right, like every time you want to build your application, it has to download, I don't know how many libraries, hundreds of libraries that you don't know
Yep.
what they're doing.
Yep.
So it has been this trend of more and more dependency. I would say codependency on libraries and packages, right? So um, it's very interesting that you're able to like get everything together and just analyze it before it runs.
The other reason we want to do it before it runs, because if it runs and it's bad, now you have to deal with all of the repercussions of running something that's bad.
Right.
Whether it's a Bitcoin miner that seems to pop into libraries sometimes versus like someone taking your data. Once when something's running, it's running, and then you have to like, oh, where did it go? Let me pull that Docker containers like, hey, where's that running in the cloud right now? Can I pull that down? Can I stop it?
Right. At one point I was imagining your approach of, you put it in a cage and you see how it behaves, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I can understand that, how that could be, dangerous, right?
I mean, it can be dangerous. Anytime you're dealing with something that could be malicious, it's going to be a little dangerous.
Right.
It's like you're running it in a virtual machine, which is pretty common if you're doing like malware detonation. Well, there's ways of getting out of virtual machines if you have a good exploit.
Oh, there are ways to get out of virtual machines. Interesting.
I mean,
yeah,
anything is possible if you get an exploit.
yes. And we come back to this, like eventually, you're at a point where you don't trust anything, any libraries, anything, right? Because you can't, right? You shouldn't.
One of the things I like to say is you need to be a little paranoid, not entirely paranoid, but being a little paranoid about what's going on the internet is probably better than trusting everything.
Right.
Maybe healthy paranoia.
I think paranoia is healthy if it's a little bit, right? It's like salt, we're talking about salt before, right?
Right.
A little bit is fine, but it shouldn't consume you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like sometimes I get emails and I'm like, okay, I know this is actually legitimate, but it looks so wrong.
I got a mail. I can forward you the mail because it's funny. And basically they say, it says my phone number, my address. It says, I know I could reach you to this phone number, or I could go to your house at this address, right? And I know what you've been doing, and I know you've been doing naughty things. He kind of implies, that he can access to my Wi-Fi or whatever, right? And then, you have to send me whatever Bitcoins, or I will publish everything you've been doing, I would expose
right.
you, the thing is, they don't know that I don't live it in that address, right? But that's the address registered to, to my data, right?
Right.
So it's very interesting. So I read it and I laugh, right? Yeah.
Right.
And I've got like 3 different, because I have different addresses for different things, and
Right.
I've got the same email from, for different situations, right?
Three different emails from the same person. I know you're this person at this address. I also know you're this different person at this different address.
Yeah. So we're a little bit over time, so I apologize. We can wrap up with one last question if you like. What are your goals, or what do you dream to accomplish this 2025, which just started 9 days? We're January 9,
just 9 days ago.
9 days ago.
Yeah, I mean, for 2025, it's been. I think the things we were talking about early are like balance, right? Like I have a family, I have a company, and making sure that what I want to accomplish is be intentional and present wherever I am. So like, okay, I'm working right now. I'm going to work hard. Okay, I'm going to go with my kids. I would be with them, and
Right.
that way I can be content, right? I can do the things that I can do because there's only so much any one person can do. So if I can do that, if I can help grow my company so that I can be able to help more people, if I can show my kids and my wife that I love them and I want to take care of them, like those are the 2 main things for me right now.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Hopefully with, by putting it out there, it's, it's closer to become a reality, right? Yeah. And
Hopefully.
if I can help in any way, just let me know. right?
Absolutely. All right. I appreciate it.
Right, right. It was great to have you, Andrew, and I'm looking forward to talk, at another time, and see how you're accomplishing all these dreams, which are amazing.
It, it was great to be here. Thank you so much.